Part of the fun of thrifting is never knowing what you're going to find. Sometimes you see things with great potential, but let's be honest, sometimes you just see junk. So for today's video, I thrifted 10 completely random thrift store finds. Most of them are outdated or ugly. A few of them are even broken, but they all have potential. And now I want to show you how you can take each one and transform it into something truly special and unique for the holidays. So let's get started. When I saw this vintage wall clock for only $6.99, I couldn't put it in my cart fast enough. You guys know I love clocks. This one doesn't seem to work and the pendulum isn't attached, so it seemed the perfect candidate for a Christmas DIY. Every clock is a little different, but most of the time, if you just start removing all of the screws, everything will come out easily. I'll repurpose the clock cabinet later in today's video, but for now, I'm just going to use the clock face. I printed out an image of an antique clock face to cover the existing one, but before attaching it, I painted over the silver outer rim with black chalk paint to give it an older appearance. And since the clock hands were shiny, I painted over them too. To attach the paper, I sprayed the clock face with adhesive. But then I realized I could remove those gold rings in the two holes. So I pried them off and then adhered the paper. To make the new clock face look even more authentic, I cut the paper from the two holes and reattached the gold rings. This 99-cent frame was meant to hold a decorative plate, but it was also the perfect size for my clock face. I cleaned it really well and then applied some antiquing wax in a thick layer and let it dry without wiping any of it off. I wanted to replicate the look of old varnish that has gotten darker over time. Once the wax was mostly dry, I placed the clock face into the frame, just using the plate brackets to hold it in place. I could have attached a battery-operated clock mechanism to create a working clock, but since I'm just making Christmas decor, I just hot glued the clock hands in place. To further age the wood frame, I applied some oil-based black wax to make it look even darker and add a bit of sheen. Now, to make it Christmas specific, I first added a small plastic mouse along the bottom of the clock and then hot glued some pine stems, tiny pine cones, and red berries around the mouse. I also added a tiny bow with the red tails hanging down to attract the eye. Finally, I printed out the words Christmas time, which I decoupaged over the brand name printed on the clock face. When I spotted this pretty tray at Goodwill, I immediately thought it would make a great base for a centerpiece. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit record, but here's what I did. I glued a small piece of styrofoam in the center of the tray and started adding greenery stems that I already had on hand. Some of them weren't even Christmas specific, like lamb's ear and eucalyptus. Then I hot glued a little lamb with a broken leg that I thrifted for $3 right in the center, directly over the styrofoam. Once I was done adding greenery, I hot glued reindeer moss over any exposed pieces of styrofoam. To give the tray a little height, I grabbed an old candlestick from my stash and glued it to the underside of the tray using E6000. While the glue was drying, I decided to make the arrangement look more wintry.
So I sprayed the greenery with adhesive and sprinkled on some fake snow. Then I went back over it with another light coat of spray adhesive and this time dusted on some iridescent glitter. One of my favorite things to do at Christmas time is to thrift old, worn out decorations and give them a new life. I think some people on social media call this a glow up. I wanted to drill a hole through the wooden base to run a dowel rod up through the three snowballs to make it sturdier, but that didn't go quite as planned. I decided the best option was to cut off the large bottom snowball and just focus on the two smaller ones on top. To freshen up the yarn, I trimmed away the outer, slightly matted layer all the way around both snowballs. I also took off his hat and scarf, and since I wasn't too fond of his face, I removed his eyes and mouth, but I did keep his cute little carrot nose. I still needed to make the two snowballs sturdier and ensure they stayed connected. So I whittled one end of a small dowel rod to a point and ran it up through the bottom snowball and out the top of the snowman's head. To make the snowman sparkly, I sprayed the yarn balls with adhesive and then applied iridescent glitter. The snowman's original hat and scarf were okay, but I wanted to give him an updated look. So I found a tiny hat on a miniature tree ornament from Walmart and hot glued it to his head. To finish his face, I used a sponge pouncer dipped in pink acrylic paint to give him some rosy cheeks. Instead of cutting off the dowel rod, I decided to drill a hole in a small wood slice and insert the end of the rod into it with a little wood glue. I decorated the base with a few small pine cones, a little tree, and a miniature rabbit, then covered the remaining exposed wood with fake snow. While the snow was still wet, I sprinkled on some iridescent glitter for a little shimmer. I also added a touch of fake snow to his hat, which I probably could have skipped because right after that, I decided to make a little bird's nest out of Spanish moss. I twisted it into a small circle, hot glued it to his hat, and added a tiny plastic bird and a few berries inside the nest. And even though I chose not to replace his mouth, I did swap out his plain white buttons for some much cuter vintage red ones. And if you've watched my channel for any length of time, you know I can't leave those stick arms empty. So I decided to make a little garland using a strand of florist wire and some small rusty jingle bells. I cut a skinny strip of sheet moss to use as a new scarf. And since the garland kept sliding off the sticks, I hot glued a little tuft of Spanish moss at the end of each arm to hold it in place. At the last minute, I swapped out the tiny Christmas tree in the base for a small pine branch that just felt better proportioned to the snowman. I still had the large yarn snowball left, so I thought I'd see if I could turn it into a cute piece of Christmas decor. I started by trimming the surface of the yarn to freshen it up since it was looking a little sad and matted. and then I sprayed it with adhesive and sprinkled on some iridescent glitter to give it a pretty shimmer. I hot glued a small ceramic figurine of a boy pulling a sled to the top of the snowball. Then I printed out the phrase, "Let it snow," on a piece of paper and decoupaged it onto a small strip of Christmas ribbon. I sprayed the back of the ribbon with adhesive and pressed it onto the side of the snowball. Once it was adhered, I brushed a coat of Mod Podge over the ribbon and paper and added a bit more iridescent glitter for extra sparkle. I thought it would be fun to hang the snowball instead of just setting it out somewhere, and I had a banana stand that I thought might just work. I used a large needle to thread some florist wire through the top of the snowball, then formed a loop with the wire so that I could hang it from the hook. To dress it up a bit and disguise the hook, I wrapped a small pine cone and a little greenery around the top. This turned out to be a genuine trash to treasure thrift flip. I thrifted this vintage style glass shade for just $1 and then searched the store for a candlestick to pair it with. This black candlestick was fine, but I wanted it to look older and more in keeping with the vintage shade. So I used Modern Masters Rust Effect paints. First, I applied the brown primer and let it dry. Then I added 2 coats of the iron paint. Once the second coat was dry, I sprayed on the rust activator. Using a heat gun helps speed up and intensify the rusting process, but it will continue to develop naturally over the next day. To embellish the candlestick, I added a few metal holly leaves I thrifted for 50 cents. I aged them with Dixie Belle's iron patina paint. I brushed on 2 coats, and while the second was still wet, I sprayed on the blue patina spray to create a verdigris finish that will contrast nicely with the rusty candlestick. Then I just wrapped the wire stem around the candlestick to hold it in place. I placed the glass shade upside down on the candlestick, but to make it look more intentional, like it actually belonged with the base, I glued a small metal cup from my stash to the top of the shade, and then to cover the hole, I added an upholstery tack. I finished it off with a satin ribbon for a pop of color and added a battery-operated votive candle inside for a soft glow. When I saw the red mat on this $2 picture, I thought it would be perfect for Christmas decor. But obviously, the Coca-Cola print had to go. I removed the backing from the frame, but when I went to remove the print, it was glued to the mat. Luckily, I was able to pry it off without damaging the mat. I searched online for vintage Christmas images that included a red bow and decided to print out the cute dog picture because I thought it looked best with the red mat. Once I put the frame back together, I used paper packing tape along the edges to secure everything because I can never get all of those little staples or flex points back in place. I reattached the original sawtooth hanger And for a final touch to make this picture extra special, I hot glued a red velvet ribbon to the glass. Alternatively, you could leave off the glass if you prefer. Now that farmhouse style is declining in popularity, people are donating their galvanized metal items to Goodwill, like this pair of trees. Luckily for us, they are perfect for a DIY makeover. I painted the metal cones with white chalk paint, and one coat provided good coverage. Then I painted the base of each tree with Dixie Belle's bronze patina paint. I had a couple of different ideas for these trees, but I settled on covering them with a pine patterned paper napkin. When using 3-ply paper napkins, make sure to remove both of the plain white plies so that you're just left with the very thin pattern ply. To avoid wrinkles, tear the napkin into smaller pieces. Then brush Mod Podge onto the tree and carefully press the napkin pieces into the glue. Use your paintbrush to smooth out the napkin and to apply a top coat of Mod Podge to seal it. If you love glitter, you might want to sprinkle some on while the Mod Podge is still wet. Once the tree was covered, I brushed a second coat of the bronze paint onto the base. And while it was still wet, I sprayed it with the green patina spray to create a rusty verdigris finish. Remember, using a heat gun will accelerate this process. Use sandpaper or a sanding block to rub off any excess napkin along the bottom edge. To embellish the trees, I wired a few pine stems and a pine cone around the metal rod at the base of the tree to mimic the image on the napkins. Then, to hide the wires and to hold the stems in place, I tied a plaid ribbon over the wires. I wasn't sure if this wood violin was wall decor or a serving tray, but it sure is cute. It must have been a serving tray because the wood is somewhat cracked and damaged. So, to cover it up and add a decorative element, I decided to line the inside with sheet music torn from an old hymnal. I applied the sheet music in the same way as I applied the napkin to the metal trees. And once the Mod Podge was dry, I used an X-Acto knife to cut off any extra paper along the sides. If you want to continue using this as a tray, you'll need to apply several additional coats of dishwasher safe Mod Podge. However, I wanted to use it as decor. So I filled it with a branch cut from an old thrift store Christmas tree, hot gluing the main wire to the violin. Then I added one large poinsettia that I pulled from a thrift store bouquet, and I glued it to the bottom of the branch to cover up the exposed wire. The tree branch had one single pine cone attached, so I found a couple more and wired them onto the branches too. Then I brushed them with some Mod Podge and patted on a little fake snow. I thought the arrangement needed something else that was white, so I added some berries I found in my floral supplies. Then I wanted to add a bow, but I couldn't find any ribbon that seemed just right. So I ripped a strip of green velvet off of an old dust ruffle and twisted it into a large bow with florist wire in the center. I decided I wanted the poinsettia to be sparkly, so I sprayed it with adhesive and sprinkled on iridescent glitter. Did you forget I still had that empty clock cabinet and I finally came up with an idea that I wanted to try. I bought a large sheet of styrofoam that was probably about an inch thick. I cut out two pieces to the same size and shape and stacked them on top of one another to create a hill shape that was about 2 inches thick. This would be deep enough, I hoped, to hold a couple miniature houses on top. Then I cut out two additional pieces of styrofoam to create a smaller hill in front where I planned to add a few more houses. I painted over the styrofoam with white chalk paint, and then I painted the area above the styrofoam with dark blue paint to look like sky. Unfortunately, my styrofoam hills were about 2 inches deep, but the miniature houses I had thrifted were 2.5 to 3 inches deep. So I was going to need 3 layers of styrofoam to create a base for them. So I pulled out the small hill and one layer of the large hill and reconfigured the styrofoam so that the large hill was made from just one layer of styrofoam, but the smaller hill in front was made from 3 layers. Then I repainted the styrofoam. Before attaching the houses, I ran a small strand of Dollar Tree fairy lights up through the pendulum hole and along one side of the styrofoam. Then I hot glued the remaining wire to the ceiling of the clock box. Now that the paint was dry, I covered the tall hill with Mod Podge and patted on some fake snow. Then I was ready to add a few of the miniature houses to the lower hill. Even with 3 layers of styrofoam, they were still a bit too large. So I very carefully tapped them with a hammer to press them into the front of the styrofoam comprising the large hill. Once they were flush with the front of the small hill, I covered that piece of styrofoam with Mod Podge and fake snow. Since there wasn't space to add any more houses, I began filling in with small trees and other miniature items from my stash. I had recently thrifted a small birch tree, but it was too large, so I just cut off individual branches to create smaller trees. Once everything was added, I sprayed the entire scene with adhesive and sprinkled on iridescent glitter. Even though the cabinet was made from wood, it was really dull, almost like it had been painted brown. So I decided to paint a few selected areas with moss green chalk paint just to break up all the brown and make the clock look more interesting and special. Once the paint was dry, I lightly distressed the painted areas with fine grit sandpaper. Then I brushed a dark oil-based antiquing wax over the clock, both on the painted sections and over the stained wood to help freshen up the wood and disguise the scratches. I used a combination of Gorilla Glue and hot glue to attach two more miniature houses and a few trees to the lower shelf. Since I only had a small area to cover, I spread snow tex around and between the houses. This is a fake snow product that dries very hard. While the snow tex was still wet, I sprinkled on iridescent glitter. And finally, I attached a thrifted ornament of Santa's sleigh and reindeer to the top of the clock. Surprisingly, my favorite projects today were the two that used leftover pieces from my thrift store finds, the clock face and the snowball. But I'd love to know which ones you liked best. And if you'd like to see more Christmas DIYs like these, here's another video I think you'll enjoy. Thanks so much for watching today. Hope to see you next week.